So this leads people to think about that while when English is used as a global language, okay, how do people use language? For example, balance our native language, our linguistic resource, and English as a global language in education. So this is the global Englishes paradigm. That the paradigm covers world Englishes, English as a lingua franca, English as an international language, and translanguaging. Although some scholars may argue that translanguaging should stand on its own. Okay, anyway, I'm not going to explore some of the theoretical bits because I don't know, a recent book review published in TESOL Quarterly, the reviewers argues that for language practitioners, they don't really want so many terms. Okay, those terms are a bit complicated. I do agree. So I'm not going to talk about those theoretical bits, but we want to see, okay, language choice, linguistic power, linguistic inequality, and some people call this linguistic racism. That's from the dominance of English to multilingual use of English to see how we recognize people's linguistic repertoire. Okay, so the first perspective is world Englishes. While that research area was developed in the 1980s, focused on the study of phonological and morphosyntactic features of post-colonial varieties of English. For example, Singapore English, Hong Kong English, Indian English. We'll see the phonological bit, for example, that Singapore English may pronounce milk, the dark L is not pronounced. They will say milk, for example, yeah? And morphosyntactic grammatical features in Singapore English, the use of lots of la or le or me, lots of particle, okay, influenced by Mandarin, yeah. So those varieties were codified. While later, in the 2000, people realized that English is not simply used within a certain community, such as Singapore English, such as Hong Kong English, Indian English, because when Singapore English is used outside the Singaporean, outside Singaporean people, for example, those varieties may create some issues on intelligibility. So English as a lingua franca focuses on the use of English across borders to see how people make meaning through negotiation, through various communication strategies, okay, through accommodation, for example. So English is positioned within a multilingual paradigm. While some scholars use another term called English as an international language, it's similar to ELF, but English as an international language focuses on teaching. Okay, so people call this teaching English as an international language. Again, I'll touch this briefly. Right? More recently, I think 2000, after 2000, 2010, 2015, another term called global Englishes. So people use the term as a more inclusive one, as an umbrella term, incorporating concepts of world Englishes, English as a lingua franca, and English as an international language, and or translanguaging. I put a question mark because still some people may not agree that translanguaging is part of global Englishes anyway. But we see the use of language in relation to education. So global Englishes, the field, extends the lens of world Englishes, ELF, and EIL to incorporate many peripheral issues associated with the global use of English, such as globalization, linguistic imperialism, linguistic racism, education, language policy, and planning. So hopefully, as language educators, um, especially when we teach online, we hold conferences online, and then when we communicate with students, with our colleagues, we'll think about our language choice. We'll think about whether, okay, the institutional policies, for example, whether we allow students to code switch, or whether we allow students to use their first language. I think this will create huge debates. Um, so many various debates in terms of language use, education language policy and assessment. So we talk about this creates a new great research area. Well, we see a new phase of English nowadays. English is one of the languages that used from a paradigm of multilingualism. Traditionally, we will see the power, we will see the dominance of English. So many people will put English at the top of the pyramid, that it has the power. We need to use English. Everyone should learn English. Okay, but from the paradigm of multilingualism, and especially the multilingual turn in applied linguistics, we may need to think about that. How do we regard English with other languages? Do we really want to sacrifice other languages to learn English and to use English? Do we really want to, in particular, our mother tongue, for example, the use of English, the dominance of English will create some other issues, such as language death, while it will lead to some cultural issues. So we are facing a new demographic trend, is that the current ratio of native speakers of English versus non-native speakers of English is around 1.4, even 1.5. So the use of English in people's daily communication is different from textbooks, for example, from dictionary, for example. And people do not really follow native standard when they communicate with other people. And people will also use their linguistic and their cultural resources, their multimodal resources to create meaning. So we also need to recognize the complexity and super diversity of language contact. This leads to, again, many terms. While scholars have various debates, the translanguaging, translingualism, macrolinguistics. Again, I'm not going to dig deep about the similarities and differences of those terms. But more importantly, I want to emphasize that global Englishes is a paradigm shift in research, teaching, and recognition of the current linguistic landscape and the sociolinguistic functions of English. It's a shift from monolingual framework to multilingual and multicultural framework and theories of English use. So think about the first picture and the first piece of news I share with you. While people are facing challenges, difficulties to have access on online teaching, while from this is a technology issue, for example, but again, how about the use of language? If they do not have access to English, the so-called de facto global language, they may also lose many opportunities. So I call this an education divide. Yeah. So before COVID-19, before the class, before online teaching, many people, the door is shut. Okay. But many people, if they do not speak proper, so-called proper standard English, they lose many opportunities to have access to many resources. So translanguaging is another research area that has been adopted to describe bi or multilingual speakers' complex language practices. So here, multiple discursive practices in which bilinguals engage in order to make sense of their bilingual worlds. It also embraces code-switching, first language use, multimodal, and further transsemiotic practices. We think about that language use in reality and language, the grammar or the textbooks that we are familiar with, that we are using for language educators, for teachers. To some extent, many textbooks create a distance by language users that many contents they learn from the textbooks cannot be used, or it's different. Those contents are different from what they are exposed in daily life. So translanguaging is very natural that people use their linguistic, cultural, multimodal resources in their language practice. So I show these two examples. The first one is about, I don't know, I don't really call this what language, because again, we'll see translanguaging, that language is a social practice. Language is performed. We don't really take it for granted that this is Chinese, or we don't really take it for granted that this is Japanese, or this is English, for example. So we'll see a combination of scripts, images, etc., to create meaning. Okay, so I guess that people are able to understand from those images. We know the meaning can be, conveyed.